who go out a chance. All right, you've greeted well. You all look like you enjoy each other. That's a good thing. Well, my name is Vic Anderson. I have not been up on this platform since about May, so if some of you are perhaps newer with us from Centerpoint, it's good to see you and meet you. My wife, Cindy, and I have been part of Centerpoint, well, before it was Centerpoint. I think we have about over 40 years connected with this church and with some of these people here. And I'm one of the guys on the preaching team and just really look forward to spending these Sundays with you. And in the future, I'll be working with Steve and Andy as we lead our submission to the Word of God through the preaching of God's Word over the next several weeks. Cindy and I spent our summer in Ethiopia, as many of you know, and thank you for praying for us. It was a delight to be involved with, especially with an international evangelical church there in Addis Ababa, the capital city of Ethiopia. Cindy was involved with a large vacation Bible school, about 300 kids from, 40 or 50 countries of the world, and also involved in working with a school where kids who don't speak English were trying to learn English, and she has some specialization in that. And I enjoyed preaching about 7 straight Sundays or weekends, including a wonderful celebration at the 40th anniversary and commencement program for the Evangelical Theological College of Ethiopia, a school that I've been involved with since the early 90s. So all that to say, you will be encouraged to know that God has people around the world as part of his people. And the gospel is going out, and people are coming to Christ. And though the church faces great challenges all around the globe, it is still wonderful to see that many are serious about their faith. And so we get to be part of that as the people of God. But it's always enjoyable for me to be back with the people of God at Centerpoint. And that's who we are, the people of God, called out from the world, chosen by the Father, redeemed by the Son, being transformed by the Spirit, and journeying together to that great day when the reign of Christ will fill the earth. This week, I was involved in trying to find a good deal in a product that I needed to purchase. And if you're like me, then maybe you have had this happen to you as well, where you get on the internet and you're kind of short on time, and suddenly something flashed on my screen that looked like a really good deal for just exactly the kind of product that I wanted. And, it looked a little suspicious to me, but I thought, this is really good. They had great pictures, and I did a couple of quick checks, and this is legit, and it was like 85% off from the normal selling price. And I was in a hurry, so I thought, I'm sure this is okay. I mean, really, it looks all good. They accept PayPal, and they accept MasterCard, and it says it's a secure website, and I clicked, and off it went. And about 4 days later, I got to getting a little nervous because I had no confirmation. And I thought, I better do some more checking. Sure enough, I'd been scammed. And my money was gone, sort of. I had gone full speed ahead in this direction, and I needed to have that reversed. So fortunately, I called up my credit card company and said, hey, I've got this problem, and they were very accommodating, and they were able to very easily, it seems, reverse the direction of my error. That was great. I wish that all problems in life could be so easily reversed. Not all of them work quite that way. In fact, a few years ago, as I was going for my annual checkups for my optometrist, I remember him saying to me, you've got some cataracts developing. And The next year, you got some cataracts developing. And the next year, they're coming along. And well, can't we reverse this? It doesn't do me any good for you to tell me. How do we reverse it? And he says, no, you can't reverse it. You just wait till they get so bad that we replace your lenses in your eyes. Oh, that was discouraging. Unfortunately, there are those points in our lives where much more difficult than credit card transactions and cataracts, the evil that comes upon us is not so easily reversed. It may happen when our lives become so overwhelmed by a series of events that may or may not be our fault. But what we really wish we could do is that instead of evil advancing on us in such a direction that somehow we could get it into a reverse gear and it would be backed out of our lives. It comes when there's a sudden financial disaster and the fear begins to sink in that we aren't going to make it to the end of the month or the end of the year. It happens when, on top of that, perhaps, we find that the car broke down or the phone got stolen or the dishwasher no longer works. And, of course, when it rains, it pours, right? And the avalanche of evil upon us grows great. And then we find out that a close friend or relative has been diagnosed with a chronic illness, one that's expected to take their life in the near future. And evil seems to advance without hesitation upon us, and how we'd like to have it reversed. It is at such times that we can often just grow angry. Angry even at God, because we know that God could reverse it, but He doesn't. And we find from deep within our souls this sentiment that we may or may not even articulate, where we raise our fists at God and say, why don't you do something to reverse this evil? And if it goes on for a while, we can find bitterness that grabs us deep within. Our hope becomes hopeless. Our smile becomes an angry frown. What hope do we have that God will reverse this evil that seems to assault us? What assurance might we get that this God whom we've entrusted our lives to is in fact going to reverse this evil that overwhelms us and could bring us to bitterness? It's the question we want to answer this morning, and we're going to do so by looking at a wonderful story, a story that for many of us is quite endearing, but a story that really goes after this great question of our lives, of what God does to reverse evil in the most amazing ways when we are overwhelmed by it. What we're going to do is spend a few minutes looking at the details of this Old Testament story, a story where there is someone caught in the avalanche of evil, and she becomes angry and bitter, and many of us will identify with her. And then find that indeed God reverses that evil in the most amazing way. We want to look at some of the details of exactly what He does and how He does it. And then we'll step back and ask, is it possible that God works this way today? And if so, how? And how does that affect our faith and our sense of assurance? So I trust that you'll be encouraged. It is a great text. We're actually going to try to cover most of a whole book in one fell swoop. We are looking at the story of a woman named Naomi, a woman who indeed has been assaulted by evil. She's been overwhelmed by a decade of evil in her life. And when we break in on her story, she is angry with God. In fact, she's bitter. And in some ways, for good reason. And yet God is going to unfold in the next few chapters of this book how He can reverse her plight. So we're in the book of Ruth. I invite you to turn to Ruth chapter 1, and we're going to look at how Naomi was overwhelmed with evil that left her hopeless and bitter. And we're not going to start at the beginning. We're going to actually kind of move into the second scene of this beautiful story where Naomi and Ruth are returning to Bethlehem. And they're coming from Moab. So we're looking at Ruth chapter 1 and verse 19. So it says, "So the two women went on until they came to Bethlehem. And when they arrived in Bethlehem, the whole town stirred because of them. And the women exclaimed, 'Can this be Naomi?'" So stop for a minute and you think about this scene. The women have been off in the east for over a decade, a land called Moab. We'll talk about that place a little later. They have made this journey, a fairly long journey, to Bethlehem, and the townspeople are quite excited to see Naomi. They haven't seen her in a long time, and now she's back home, and they had left a place where there had been famine, and I can imagine the women calling out her name, "Naomi, Naomi, so good to see you." And there's an excitement, a buzz in the air. And we expect Naomi to be excited about this homecoming, a place of joy and a time to get back with old friends and familiar places and the good food that she had known for so long. And then the streets that she had walked perhaps as a child, the opportunity to worship God again. It was all coming back. But this was not to be. This was not going to be a time of celebration and joy. But because instead her words are marked with bitterness and anger. She replies with that bitterness to the women who have greeted her in verses 20 and 21. She says, "Don't call me Naomi," she told them, "call me Mara, because the Almighty has made my life very bitter. I went away full, but the Lord has brought me back empty. Why call me Naomi? The Lord has afflicted me, or he's testified against me. He's had his hand against me. The Almighty, Shaddai, has brought misfortune to me." These were not good days for Naomi, and you can hear the bitterness in her voice. Why would she say such things that God is against her, that God is literally bringing evil upon her or calamity, that she even she can't even imagine being sweet or pleasant because life has been so bitter? Well, these are we find at the very beginning of this book, the days of the judges, the days when the judges ruled. And if you're a reader of the Old Testament, you go, "Oh, that's not a good time for Israel." For in the days that the judges ruled, as you know, that this was the period of time after Moses and after Joshua, the people had settled in the land, and they were to be governed by the law, governed by God himself through his law. And yet, instead, as we know from the book of Judges, everyone did what was right in their own eyes. It was a time when the law was really ignored and discarded. It's an indication that all is not right in Israel. And God had promised back earlier in the Old Testament that when the people rejected the law, there would be serious consequences. God had promised them that there would be famine in the land. He had promised that if you reject the law and reject me in that way, that you're going to suffer. And that suffering will include an infertility to your crops and a lack of growth amongst your herds and your sheep, and even an infertility for you and your families. And there will be death. And this is exactly what Naomi was experiencing. She had left the land, but now, because there was famine there, she had escaped to this land of Moab, and she went there with perhaps just out of desperation, because Moab is a place where they usually are against Israelites. The history of Moab was not a place of kindness and reception and good vibes toward the people of Israel. In fact, it was a place where there's probably going to be trouble. In fact, she says, though, that the primary source of her anger and bitterness was the Lord himself. Did you see it there in verses 20 and 21? God opposed her. God testified against her. God brought the evil or the calamity upon her. In fact, earlier in this chapter, in verse 14, she would actually use the line that the hand of the Lord has struck out against me, like a warrior fighting against me, and I'm one of his people. Whew. Poor Naomi is not enjoying good days. What did God do to her that would make her feel such a thing? Well, the text doesn't attribute any action of God against her, but from her perspective, God had caused the death of her husband, the deaths of her 2 sons. It says here in the text, I was full, but God made me empty. I came back empty-handed. I have nothing with me. And of course, in Israel, not to have children, well, it's not quite the same as today. It wasn't just a sad thing, I wanted to have children and couldn't. Because to not have children meant no economic security in old age. It meant she was going to face retirement in poverty. She had no pension, no savings plan, no Social Security. With no children, the future looked bleak. In Israel, no children meant that there was no remembrance of you and your family in the future, that you would die forgotten by all future generations. And that was a tragedy. In Israel, no son would also mean loss of the land, the inheritance from God that had been given to your family. So for her to say, I went away full, meaning I had a husband and sons and the prospect of having children, and I came back empty, I have no hope. She's angry, bitter, hopeless. And so she says, don't even call me Naomi, because her name means pleasant or sweet. Instead, call me Mara. It means bitter. Whew. It was not a celebration on the streets of Bethlehem that day. We feel for Naomi because many of us have kind of been there. Maybe not as extreme as her, maybe more extreme than her. Many of us have had these points in our lives where we've been at the end of our rope. We have no proof that God is doing anything other than extracting the blessings out of our lives. We look for some hint that God is at work, but we can't see any. And so we shake our fists at him, feeling that the emptiness of life has overwhelmed us. So we get it, Naomi. What hope could you possibly have? And it's at this point in the story that the author begins to turn everything toward a great reversal. It seemed that for her whole last decade of her life, everything was going south. And what the author is going to do now is show us, no, God is actually at work in a whole different direction. He's taking you north. So our God completely reversed Naomi's evil. Our God completely reversed Naomi's evil. From her anger over evil and bitterness from what God had done or failed to do, God now says, no, let me show you the great reversal. Read with me in verses 13 through 17 of chapter 4. We're jumping all the way to the end. I know you hate to miss the middle, but there will be some other sermons in the middle. Chapter 4, we're all the way at the end of the story. And a man named Boaz has come along, and he has decided to take Ruth as his wife and provide for her. Verse 13 says, so Boaz took Ruth, and she became his wife. And when he made love to her, the Lord enabled her to conceive, and she gave birth to a son. And the women said to Naomi, "Praise be to the Lord, who this day has not left you without a guardian redeemer. May he, the child, become famous throughout Israel. He will renew your life and sustain you in your old age. For your daughter-in-law, who loves you and is better to you than 7 sons, has given him birth." And then Naomi took the child in her arms and cared for him. And the women living there said, "Naomi has a son." And they named him Obed. He was the father of Jesse, the father of David. Just a few verses. And in those verses, we see complete reversal of the evil that Naomi was suffering. There's so much more here than a nice, quaint little story about how a widow got a husband and how she ended up with a bouncing baby boy to bring joy to her and her grandmother. Oh, that's there. But the real thrust of this is so great, so much greater, because it speaks of how God reverses evil for his people. 3 features of this reversal that I'd like for us to see this morning. First of all, for her, the emptiness of infertility is replaced by a child. I mean, that's kind of the most obvious thing, right? That there's a child conceived because really of the Lord's intervention. This child, he says, would be the guardian of her life. Look there at verse 14 again. Or verse 13, Boaz took Ruth, and she became his wife, and the Lord enabled her to conceive, and she gave birth to a son. It says, other than God bringing food back to Israel, this is the only place in the whole book where God seems to step in and show up. It's an important moment because the reversal of infertility to fertility, from no children to children, is the most prominent sign of the blessing of God upon Naomi. But even more, the text says that this child is going to be a guardian for Naomi, to bring her life in her old age. You see it there in verse 14. Praise be to Yahweh, who this day has not left you without a guardian redeemer. Who is that? Well, you might think it's the Lord, or you might think it's Boaz, her husband. No. This guardian redeemer is actually the child. May he, this child, become famous throughout Israel because, verse 15, he will renew your life and sustain you in your old age. How wonderful. The economic despair that Naomi felt has been taken away because she has a grandson. In fact, this grandson is going to serve her. And thus they name him Obed, a word which means the one who serves. So every time she looks at this little boy, Obed, you're the one that God gave to serve. And he will serve her needs for the rest of her life, providing even economic security for her there in verse 17. So the emptiness of infertility is replaced with a child. That's the first feature of this reversal, and it's grand. Remember, she came back empty. Now she can say, oh, you've taken care of all that. Also, the emptiness is replaced with a daughter-in-law who went from an unwanted, unvalued foreigner to a full member of the Israelite community. Right? This one's easy to miss, so I want you to hang with me for just a minute. Think about what happens to Ruth, the daughter-in-law, the one who's pretty quiet in a lot of ways throughout this book. But what happens to her is she goes from an undervalued, maybe even unvalued foreigner who's going to be fully embraced as a member of God's people. You see, Ruth is from Moab. And as I said earlier, Moab's not a term of endearment. In fact, when Ruth comes with her mother-in-law and is about to leave Moab to go back to Bethlehem, Naomi says to her daughter-in-law, "Go back! Please, go back! Return to your people. Don't come with me. I can't have another baby. You're not going to come and be able to get a husband in Israel. Go back to your people. You can almost hear this hint in Naomi's voice. This is not going to be a good life if you, a Moabite, come to Israel. We aren't going to click really well. In fact, when Naomi arrives there on the streets of Bethlehem in the opening scene, did you notice what she said? Don't call me Naomi, call me Mara. I'm bitter because I've come back empty-handed. And standing right next to her is her daughter-in-law. Ruth is a non-factor. Ruth is overlooked in this text. She's a Moabite. It's fascinating what happens because this label of being a Moabite is going to plague her throughout this book until you get to the last chapter. You see, the Moabites were descendants of an incestual relationship with Lot. They get off to a bad start. The Moabites are part of those greedy people that were connected with Sodom and Gomorrah, with Lot. The Moabites were people who blocked the travels of Israel as they were making their way to the promised land. The Moabites, according to the law, were not to be shown any favor in Israel. Don't intermarry with the Israelites, the law said, and don't have them as part of your people. The Moabites, that was the nation that hired a prophet Balaam. A prophet they wanted to hire in order to curse the people of God, to curse Israel. So when people said, oh, she's from Moab, I mean, that was worse than being from Oklahoma, right? That's bad. It was considered one person who was totally unworthy with connection with God's people. No one said, oh, she's a Moabite, with a smile on their face. In fact, they said, oh, she's from Moab. But Ruth's status is completely reversed by the end of the book. How do I know this? Well, can I give you a quick little tour? 7 times between chapter 1 and chapter 4, when Ruth is mentioned, whenever Ruth is mentioned, she's always mentioned in connection with Moab. Her identity as a Moabite. So you look at chapter 1 and verse 4, and it says she's classified as a Moabite. They married Moabite women, the text says. One named Orpah, another one named Ruth. When they returned to Bethlehem, Ruth is classified, verse 22, as a Moabite. It says, and so Naomi returned from Moab. Like we didn't know that already. This is like the 3rd time they came from Moab. Accompanied by Ruth, the Moabite, her daughter-in-law, arriving in Bethlehem as the harvest began. Or in chapter 2 and verse 2, again, Ruth is addressing Naomi, and Ruth is referred to as a Moabite. We know where she's from, but the author keeps repeating it. And Ruth, the Moabite, 2:2, said to Naomi, let me go to the fields and pick up the leftover grain. And when in the field, she's not identified as Ruth, the daughter-in-law of Naomi. You know, when she's seen in the field, she's not identified as, oh, she's that loving widow with the brown hair, the newcomer to Bethlehem. No, she's identified as she is, chapter 2, verse 6, the Moabite, who came back from Moab with Naomi. It's like the author is rubbing it in. Twice in chapter 4, Boaz refers to Ruth as Ruth the Moabite. But then, he drops the Moabite label when they get married. The covenant relationship with Israel begins, and she's known as Ruth. Look again at chapter 4, verse 13. The author says, so Boaz took Ruth, and she became his wife. Not Ruth the Moabite, Ruth. I think the dropping is intentional. That in fact the author is saying, look, she's been an outcast, she's been a foreigner, she's been somebody who wouldn't be permitted as a Gentile woman, widow in the community of God's people, but something has happened. From God's hand, She's now Ruth, like Naomi and Boaz and others who are on a first-name basis, part of the community of Israel. It is perhaps one of the greatest reversals in the book, that in this story, a foreign widow woman who would be ostracized from God's people is included as part of God's community. And that is all is at least in part, I should say, for Naomi's benefit. Because this is going to be your daughter-in-law, Naomi, someone who's part of God's people. So we have the reversal from infertility to fertility, no child to child. We have a reversal from Ruth the Moabite to Ruth the Israelite. And there's a third feature here of this reversal in the story that's really quite important, and that is that the child born to Ruth and Naomi, well, from infertility to someone in the line of David. Surely you saw it, that this child is not just going to be your average child, but someone who has been positioned by the very work of God in this genealogical chain, actually to get from Judah to David. Look back again at verse 17. The women living there said, Naomi has a son. In chapter 4, verse 17. And they named him Obed, and he was the father of Jesse, the father of David. It's wonderful. A son who's going to be the father of a king. But there's more, because the text has a genealogy that's very important at the end, which says, this then is the family line of Perez. And Perez the father of Hezron, and Hezron the father of Ram. And he goes through this 10-person genealogy, strategically picking out names to demonstrate that what God has done here is given to Naomi a grandson who comes all the way from the line of Judah, the line promised to have a king. And all this time, God has been at work to bring into existence a series of births in a lineage to raise up Israel's greatest king, their Messiah for their day. What a reversal. A complete reversal of evil for Naomi. Not only reversal, actually an overwhelming. She didn't go back to 0. She went to plus 100 on the scale of God's blessing. How did God do all of that? How did God reverse evil like that? May I suggest to you that the reversal of evil occurred as God worked providentially through his people. It occurred as God worked providentially through his people. God worked, first of all, let's talk about through his people. He worked through actually the loyal love of his people. He worked through people who demonstrated this kind of covenant loyalty to others in